Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me see how clear my voice is. I got new headphones, guys. This is a big development. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode. Okay. As the moment turns, so do we. Attention drives meaning. We look at reality and we find that our response to it can be said to be our imagination. Without reality, it is very hard to pinpoint a sort of reference to what is imagined or what is subjectively conceived. When you try to see all the dimensions of human experience in one way, the only common denominator would be the attributeless space. But if you want to see things different in their own sense, in some sense, it means that you are entertaining a multidimensional perspective of reality. That means right now, as I'm sitting here and giving this talk, am I the presence of one dimension, or is my mind awake in multiple rooms? The way the imagination has come across to me is that it's the room that is personal to my eyes. That means it's as if every human being has a unique DNA, has a unique perception, and they have their own eyes. And so, what that means is imagination is your private room where reality has more flexibility in shifting in probability. I look at a pen right now on my laptop, and I can close my eyes and visualize this pen kind of shooting out of the window and at the speed of light moving towards the sun. The mind can visualize, the mind can animate where objective reality does not permit. So it comes across to us as a sort of mind-body dualism, as Rene Descartes would suggest, that it's as if we are not just present in an objective manner, but all this objectivity seems to follow the direction of a subjective free will. Now, how can a subject be free? How can a concept that requires the past for definition be able to define itself anew? As the moment turns, so do we. A suggestion that the world influences us on not just an objective level, but also on a subjective level. And so, really, I find it's a symbiosis of individualism with collectivity. This is the most important, one of the most important dualities that must be confronted by every human being. You see, we identify with a certain position of atoms in space. The uniqueness of of the position of these atoms in space are that they are governed by an attention. Now, I have been living under the impression that everything in life can be a concept until I began to see the limits of the technology that language is. We can say that as much as there are different sets of eyes, there are different ways that the world is animate to people. And I feel a lot of true information of what is going on in the world is behind our eyes, and it deserves to be communicated. And as I say, the era of advanced communication, it is not just enough to worship language and feel life is satisfied. There is a quest for exploration that must immediately occur in the educational system. There is life must be seen. It's like you won't get serious about it until the playgrounds that you walked in become battlefields. And when they become battlefields, then the fight for true value emerges, where the human being has to confront not just how there is a temporal component to the objective self, but that there is in some sense a temporal element to the subjective self. That means I say we are not thoughts, because in many moments I've had various thoughts, and how can I be all of them? Do you see? So in some sense, there's an experiential observer of an existential object and a semi-existential subject. I find a great way to live is to honor the unknown. And what the unknown means is that what you don't know becomes as valuable to you as what you know. And that's when authenticity has a value. Many people will not apply their true intelligence, let's say, to a problem until they feel there is value. And that's I don't want to say it's a folly of our civilization, but we are reward oriented creatures. That means it's like, do this, get this, do this, get this, do this, get this. And centuries and centuries of people are entering the system, and they're doing what they're told, and they're getting what they've been told, and only to realize that in every moment that you decide to continue a past pattern, a new pattern could have emerged. That means if it's like, would you want to see your future self or your past self? You'll notice the past self you've already seen. So, guys, in the comment section, due to the nature of these episodes being a live stream, some episodes I just record the talk, edit it, and upload it. But these are live streams because I encourage audience engagement. So William has said in the chat section, would that be space consciousness? I'm not sure what you're referring to, but really, the consciousness will appear to itself as space when an experiential observer is attributeless to the attributes of the object and subject. That means I notice that we are not just a relationship of how the world has emerged, the self. After some point of conscious free will, the self began defining the world. And so I call that the linguistic simulation, how really in language a person has freedoms that they don't have in objectivity. I can speak about the unknown by speaking about the known linguistically. But there are certain things that we cannot know. It's like we can, through language, wonder about what's behind a black hole, but objectively, I don't see a black hole in front of me. Consciousness is incredibly fascinating because it is unknown. It's like an unknown variable in a mathematical equation. That's what the soul is. And if it is being given a value, um, it will not be unknown. If you consciously, as Carl Jung says, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and call it fate. So if you consciously make the unconscious conscious, what will emerge is that a new step in a new world where your mind feels authorized to exist in. The issue with intelligence and people's intellect is not about whether people are smart or stupid. That is a very hollow duality, narrow way of seeing it. People's intelligence is either inhibited or not. I don't see an edge to intelligence. That means intelligence has to do with response, and it has to do with the state of mind of the person. That means really the concept of, for example, the IQ test, even though it has some value, we needed it for culture's sake, to just to have the concept. But really, it is outdated, and it doesn't make sense, because how can one moment of expression define the totality of the intelligence of a journeyer whose journey isn't finished? How can you measure a building? How can you measure something that is endless? How can you measure the sky with a ruler? And when you realize that, there comes a sensitivity to the limits of language as a technology of your experiential use. So that is the thing. I found the imposter. I found the imposter in our civilization. It is not secret groups, it's not anything. It is a lack of sensitivity to the language that is defining us in certain unique ways. That means we have to free our species from its belief that language in one moment is it. So that's kind of what I'm suggesting here. As the moment turns, so do we. What does that mean? That means a macrocosmic action defines our microcosmic stasis. It's as if I've had moments where I've really wondered how important my life is, because I've thought about the child's psychology starts off from a dependent position. As it begins to see the different faces of the world, it begins to be introduced to systems of chaos. So really, we can kind of say, if you don't have an order at first, a sort of organized kind of order, you can't really conceive chaos. Chaos would be uninterpretable at that point. Like a young child that doesn't understand what a bomb is yet. Do you know? So it's like that chaos is incomprehensible, because the child doesn't even have the context for the concept to exist. This is why when somebody speaks, most speakers are focused about just getting the concepts out there, rather than actually building the context where it becomes the practical, subjective world the listener feels they're in. Language is very powerful. It was, to be honest, language back in the day, it was such a mind-blowing technology for people. It was magic, literally. Like when you look at children being learning spelling in schools, I'm telling you, language is a world in a world, and there have been many people, especially in concerns to black magic or whatever, whatever that banner holds. It has been manipulation of subjective realms. And so it's really important, because there is a karmic influence. Uh, you cannot become bigger without confronting the influence of the extension. It is the destruction of the concept of sameness. That's when true novelty enters the experiential domain. That's one of the most beautiful ways that the mind as an instrument can be played. The sincerity to see what is here. That means you got to think about the psychology of a king to be back in the day. The king to be didn't want to be a king, cared for the kingdom, and then found himself to be in the position. I feel what people are lacking in their life is uh, something that they should care for that will extend their value. In my science fiction, I'd created a story uh, of this world where the world was called Historia. And Historia was a world where they had managed to stop crime and violence through one mad scientist had suggested a very ingenious philosophy. And this mad scientist that had suggested this ingenious, let me say like a mad philosopher. This mad philosopher who had suggested this ingenious method to governing violence, reducing violence, his method was that people ultimately in life, he considered that this is the story I'm telling you of the science fiction thing I wrote. This scientist, or let's say mad philosopher, suggests this idea that people ultimately in society as social creatures care for what continues. You look at people having families, you look at people starting businesses, all the attempts seem to be for the continuity of what is there as far as it can. So ultimately, people are not just living in their own mind, they are living in the mind of history, and this is why the extension of ideas before beyond the human objective lifetime has a value. So what I mean by that is that there is a legacy. So this philosopher in this sci-fi story called Historia, the person realizes that because everybody wants a legacy, the ultimate punishment is not imprisonment, it is exile from history. And so Historia is a world where, I'm going to make this short film one day, in the short film, like I just see this scene where this philosopher, the mad philosopher who suggests that the idea is being kicked out. And as he's being kicked out in Historia, he sees some people killing themselves inside Historia before being exiled. Because if you die in Historia, you will be remembered. But if you don't, if you die outside of the walls of Historia, you will be forgotten. They will burn everything that was about your identity, like all the documents and everything, as if you will not exist in society and in history. So that was kind of like the government's way of keeping civility, the ultimate punishment of the exile of one's legacy, exile from their own legacy. So in that science fiction novel, Historia, I find ultimately many of we have short-term desires and long-term desires. Sometimes the long-term desires can animate as nostalgic emotions, but ultimately the eyes will roar one day and you will never be the same after that. Life is not about maintenance of the past per se only. It is about the freedom of experience to move beyond its self contained limits in it through existence. So I'm pretty much saying our attention as living beings is um, an ability for us to navigate our personal existence. And you can also navigate collective planes of existence, but that would be a bit different. Ultimately, guys, I feel any sort of concept of liberation or enlightenment would just point to how, at some point, you are considering an activity of an individual doer, and this sense of individual doership suddenly realizes, regardless of what it does, the energy is being there. So it's kind of realizing that your energy is being the foundation of your expression. Does energy have a personality? On some sense, no. It has various ways it animates, but it doesn't mean it is the person. So it's like us having, as human beings, such an intimate relationship with our existence that we find that the experience is like a glass orb upon this surface of the earth. And this is very important. So William, in the comment section, if you're listening, this is what I feel space consciousness would appear as the Yoga Patanjali Sutras say, a glass orb moving through various colored surfaces. Sometimes I find that the environment is automatically a part of my thinking because it is imagery that is present in the moment. You can't do much about that. When I talk about the subjective realms, it is in some sense um, imagery that is there prior. It's like the context to the conscious concept are unconscious. So pretty much the suggestion, this is what Carl Jung perhaps didn't say, that when you truly enter the unconscious to make it conscious, when the conscious tries to make the unconscious truly conscious, what occurs is that the consciousness has to confront no longer just being responsible for the character in the story. So you suddenly become, you realize your mind in this moment is not just being your sense of self. It is not just being an ego. It is not just being an individual relationship. It is all the phenomenology present now. And this is the fascination. Interesting. The fascination of a new train of thought. Some of the most beautiful moments in this lifetime I've experienced have been moments where I have been alone in the cosmos and in the edge of a sort of inner failure, I began to see the vastness of the process that we are a part of, you know? So it's kind of hilarious that we are living beings interpreting the world as lifeless and then thinking that our purpose is void. So I realized that there is a life more intimate than subjectivity. That means you, dear listener, right now in this moment and in every moment of your life have been experiencing yourself as awareness, but have also been dwelling and navigating through various archetypal senses of self. And so there is an incredible, how can I tell you? I was very privileged to have a very kind, you know, you know, kind of, religious grandmother who every time she would cook food and, when we would go to her family for dinners, she would say, "This food is beautiful." She would not say it's tasty. She would not get too specific. She would just say, "This is beautiful. You have to try it." And it was like a very kind of enlightened way in my eyes to be able to see that if the moment is self-generated, it can be beautiful from the beginning. That means more than people feeling that intelligence is something to accumulate, it's something to remember. Oh my God, awesome. Okay, so welcome, guys. This is awesome. We have people tuning in from Thailand. The evolution of the world as the mind dares to step out of it, step out into it. Okay, yeah. So William in the chat section, guys, has asked the difference between object consciousness and space consciousness. So it's very fascinating because some things that often feel in through our common sense unexplainable, really you have to when the concept can't go further, the context can. So ultimately, what's changing in all narratives and in the realm of language is either self is changing first and then the world is changing, or the world is changing first, then the self is changing. So we have to be conscious of this kind of pattern, finding it in language, because language is ultimately a dualistic technology. But when it comes to human experience comes across as a singular presence. Like right now, you feel that you're experiencing one moment, you know? But when we bring language into it, this moment can fragment into many ways of acknowledgement. So William, I would say that this is how I kind of see the difference between objective consciousness and space consciousness. Okay, I have said before that your body is made of earth, your mind is made of sky. I have said that in front of your eyes, reality, there are many conditions for survival, but behind your eyes, there is an unconditional freedom for the attention to evoke imagery or move as objectivity. So, if we want to say objective consciousness and space consciousness, the first thing they both share is they're both consciousness. So, they are both ways that the conscious moment is being acknowledged. I have experienced states of mind where literally there was no individuality. Somebody could have come and asked me a question, and I would not be experiencing myself as a thought. I could remain forever in that moment of silence because no identification with a subjective mask, a mask of language. So, object consciousness is really how you're experiencing phenomenology being static. Now, everything is changing in this cosmos, but appearances are stable enough for us to work on. That means one thing we should all be grateful for is that the surface of the earth is not so changing that we can't walk on it. It's solid and stable enough for us to walk on the surface of the earth. It's as if the earth knew human beings were going to show up. That's why, it's like sometimes you got to ask, why is it that an apple fits the palm of man's hand? And so did the ape evolve to adjust to the apple? Or did the apple, was the world also adjusting and adapting to man? As if the world is surviving too, what? So the thing is, objective consciousness and space consciousness has to do with how there is a presence of an observer. Object consciousness has to do at most, oh my God, has to do with um, the personified individual. Just a second, guys. I'm gonna mute this phone. You can't really do much about an object. That means here, I could say a perfect example to kind of get this Get the image I want to communicate as the response to the question. Buddha said objects are empty, and people freaked out. And, people asked why. And Buddha said, because when you look at that object, and when someone else looks at that object, what that object means to each of you is different, even though it's the same object. That means object consciousness and space consciousness experientially are the same moment. It's like how can you be aware of matter without space? How could you be aware of something without nothing first? Ultimately, consciousness doesn't need a personality, guys. This is something very crucial. That means many people, including my own family members, my father, my brother, um, many of my friends, ultimately, when they come to converse with me about the nature of how I feel the existence is constituted, I come from a school of thought, my own school of thought, that really the concept of the soul or consciousness doesn't have a personality. So to some people that might be chaotic. They might be like, "Whoa, man, you don't believe you're a transmigrating soul, eternal soul?" And I'll be like, I mean, images can be questionable." When your eyes become a once in a lifetime opportunity to engage the only world that is here, I am telling you, genius will find you. When you care for your reality, I don't know how to say it, but it's making me a bit emotional just thinking about it. That I dwelled really as a bewildered, ignorant fool until 2011. And I could tell you, with the past experience of being a fool, that moment when a condition changes and it changes efficiently, you are welcomed by the universal sector. Do you know what I mean? It's like when behind your eyes the world and you are the same moment, there is a hidden joy that is everywhere. And I don't know what like it's experiential oriented. It's kind of like looking at how consciousness flickers, how our attention flickers between consciousness and unconsciousness, and we're like, huh, okay, that's the design. What are you gonna do? People wake up, people sleep, people wake up, people sleep, and it's like people. It's sometimes it's fascinating to me. Sometimes I sit down and I think that there was a time where I go back in my own personal history and I didn't exist. you know, at some point, I didn't exist to myself the way I am existing to myself now. And when I go back into that kind of memory, pre thought, pre language, you know what I realize? I realize when one is in heaven, there is no longer any heaven or hell. Only when you are not somewhere, you storify it. You can say language is a byproduct of us trying to see beyond the world, trying to move the world without hands. It's like if this was a riddle, somebody came up to you, imagine like Mr. Within, if I saw you and I'm like, okay, man, how can you move the world without your hands, without touching the world? You would close your eyes and realize how the worlds behind your eyes have ever always moved. That's the cool thing about the human species. It has advancement, but it has to realize we have to maintain the inner life and we have to maintain the outer life. Now, if the outer life defines you too much and you're too obsessed and defined by the outer life, you won't care about your inner life, so you would be a good soldier. You would be a good person for like a repetitive action for the rest of your life. But if you're a person who When you look at this world and you look at what it is, but you also look at what it can be, your mind becomes its own commander. The free will is not afraid to be free beyond the definition of a free will. Dare to breathe in new ways. I remember the first sentence I felt that really made me feel as if I'm a writer was it was the first sentence that I felt it came from within me, truly. And I remember writing it, and the quote was, I put it on my wall even at the time, and it was, I don't want to live in a world that looks the same the next day. And this meant that if the mind has acknowledged the pattern fully, it can move on to other patterns. If the mind has not acknowledged the pattern fully, it can move on to other patterns, but will be held back by, it's like some part of your attention is still fragmented in your past. And this is a unique thing because we feel the past came and went, you know. But when you, if you were to ask the mind, the mind would say, I moved the past. So therefore, when you observe objectivity, the objective realm, the objective self and the objective realm, and when you observe the subjective self and the subjective realm, and when you realize the dance between these two worlds is many horizons of emotions, and once you have flown over the clouds of the emotional stability required for vision to be activated, what happens is you come face to face with the unknown, and in that moment, you will realize the only true teacher of this world is behind your eyes. You will realize the universal presence. That means the universal presence is not a universe. It is not a shape per se. It is not an object. It is the instantaneity of being. And it is so brilliant that it's like you see everything that is complex and the simple source of attention that brings it about. And when you realize that your eyes are the universe's eyes, then your voice finds you. Then it's as if like your past senses of self, whether good or bad, they all bow. And you look to your future self and you see the future self as bowed to the present moment. And what happens is you come to the completion of a certain program of an archetype. And when you can, like, just like how you, for example, take off your jacket when you come home, you can also navigate through ideology with such simplicity, then then the era of advanced communication has truly begun, you know. We see our planet has an axis, and every personality and archetype has an axis, which means energy is like a light and intelligence is like the shadow. So we can say the mind is like the shadow of the soul, and the body is like the shadow of the mind. Different intensities of movement and intelligence define us. I have sat in many classrooms, many moments of how life appeared to me. But in all those moments, there was something in the moment that, whether I liked or not, was being. And when you find the strength of how you are being, that's a sort of freedom of the empty page. That's a sort of tabula rasa freedom. When you realize you can tell yourself any story, but are you the story? That sensitivity to language will help the advanced communicators of tomorrow. Civilization must become a collective ability, and it must become one of tolerance. So what that means is we must create a safe enough environment where the inner genius behind people's eyes has a shot at communicating. And so what I've realized is we have the most fascinating technologies, but we don't have enough of a decency as a species and in our human nature to allow the greatness of these technologies to be implemented. That means Mr. Within is kind of saying, I feel our species is using language the wrong way. It is reaching a metamorphosis point where we can no longer just exist through linear notions. We have seen them too long. We have looped in those recognition patterns for too long, recognition programs for too long. And so to free the mind means to free the self from the conditions of its world, ultimately. That means if you go look at the yogic mind back in the day, what was the yogi trying to do? The yogi saw the world as a dream, and he saw materiality, the source of karma, this Maya. And so what the yogi would do was the yogi would be like, okay, wrong room, wrong existential room, and would close its eyes trying to rediscover the self beyond the limits of the world. But what it is that this is the truth. It's not about just the activation of your personal realms, your inner realms. It is only when you engage life and you do it through a natural sincerity that it's as if the lords of karma are like, all right, he's cool, let him in the club. So that's what I mean. It has to do with your sensitivity to life. It has to do with how Henry David Thoreau said, it's not what you're looking at that matters, it's what you see. The seer within is not a concept, and that was the most important discovery of my lifetime, one of the most important discoveries of my lifetime. That language is something that my attention moves before the language defines my attention. Because ultimate freedom would mean freedom to be nothing. So when you have the freedom to be nothing and you experience that, you will only be left to experience the freedom of something. It's like I could totally see like how many people on this planet, if there was someone on the street in like a modern Western society, if somebody got hurt or something, happened, the person would immediately help. People care for human life. They empathize naturally. So when something happens, others come to assist. Okay, so what that means ultimately is that human beings are caring for the physical experience of other human beings, where many people have said it's like the whole point of this advanced civilization we're seeking is that not only your rights are also my rights. What that means is your freedom is my responsibility as much as my freedom is your responsibility. it's like I can see it, guys. Sometimes I feel the world is not a dream per se, and it's nobody's fault how my eyes are. Sometimes I experience life like that. And when I wonder in that moment, when I cannot use something else to define the thing I am, I find myself empty handed. And in that empty handed moment, I've experienced many empty handed moments in this life. And in those empty handed moment, in that empty handed moment, I do not, it's like there's nothing bothering me. And it's strange where it's kind of like a comfort with existential silence. And then your inner realms are activated with greater freedom. So it's kind of strange. It's like the more you understand silence, the better your communication becomes. Your own silence, the silence that is the common silence and the common space of your objective truths and your subjective truth, your inner truths, your personal truths. Because really, we have sparked language on this planet. We have sparked it. Just like the caveman discovered fire, we discovered that we could connect sound to objectivity through symbology. Thoughts. This is kind of I guess it's a good thing that's been brought up in the chat section. You see, I don't entertain the concept. Thinking for me doesn't make sense. That we think. For me, it's more like we are a receiving mechanism, and our intelligence is like an antenna. And so we're not per se thinking, we are receiving, and what we receive is accumulated in a stationary sphere. So what I mean by that is that your sensory perception, um, how do I say it? Thoughts come and go. You can choose to identify it and feel you thought it, you know. Back in the day, there were strangely very few distractions. And perhaps the only civilization accessible were just houses, nomadic houses. And so we see it's like, what would the person do? The person would come and see the limits of their reality, and ultimately, when they engage life, realize that there is more to it, that's when the mind would begin entertaining the unknown. So this is kind of strange, but I feel as the person takes more laps around the sun, because the sophistication of their intellect is maturing like good wine. Depth automatically becomes increased, therefore the unknown becomes more visible. So when a person can exert less conscious free will, the more they feel the world is moving them. So this is pretty much very common in life, that it's kind of like you go on top of the hill and then you come down the hill. This is why I say that like half of your life, the first half, it's like you should live as a body first, then a mind, and the other half you should live as a mind first, then a body. And you can of course choose. I'm just suggesting that care for the resources that nature has given to itself. Swami Krishnananda, this guy, says, they asked him what is religion, and he said he's a Vedic guy. He says religion is God remembering himself, and the disciple just started crying and just like shocked. It's like, whoa, what does that mean? Oh my God! It's like where there was never people here. It was God all along being God. There was never people. Where the concept of the individual was an illusion, just like how a drop in an ocean, it was never a drop, it was never destined to be a drop. The coolest thing we can do is treat our civilization as a 4 billion year old science project and attend it. That means it's like, in my youth, there were many things that I felt other people were doing, and I was just comfortable not caring. I began to see there's so many things not being attempted. There is an endless source of creativity. When people say writers get writer's block, I don't. Doesn't make sense to me. You know. Let me tell you why. It's rather than thinking creativity is something generated in emptiness, it's kind of like creativity is this endless landscape, just like how there's endless stars as far as the eye can see. It's like everything of existential design is already here. It is just the conscious reception of it. So it's like one mentality is starting from scratch, the other mentality feels all the solutions are there. We just have to find them. Do you know? It's as if, so what that means is you are either your world is creative or yourself is creative. If you identify creativity to just your sense of self, then it's so easy to get writer's block because your identity can't move. But when you experience yourself as a presence in a moment, the vast array of ideologies that are accessible, and how sometimes when you start something, like think about it, how does one kind of bring fire um, in a survival setting? You know, they begin moving two meaningless points, and suddenly a meaning sparks. And so this is why sometimes in life it is required to act before even having a plan, because the plan will not emerge until you see what's behind the door. That's the value of experience. And it's pretty much, I call it that these are all symptoms of the emergence of civilization 2.0. The sensitivity to language renders an individual freedom and to identify with a new sense of collectivity, which means that all the nations we see now will be realized they were never nations, they were sub nations. And what were they sub nations of? Of the future civilization. So it's, of it this way, that if the members of the species are thinking about themselves, I got a past self, I got a present self, I got a future self. So guess what? The civilization is being seen as if a past civilization, present civilization, future civilization. But if the experience of the individual in civilization stepped out of a fragmentation of time in that linearized way, what would happen? I would say the most remarkable thing would happen the first time the man becomes a conscious miracle. It is when your world is intelligent, and your intelligence is based on how well you're seeing it. Life is rhythmic, it's not always conceptual. Many moments in life, they're just simple moments of attention doing basic tasks like grabbing a water, or kind of like eating food, or like going for a walk, or going, for example, writing, various things. For me, a lot of things objectively are really what opinion you have on a cup on a table. It is just a phenomenological position. It is, to me, sometimes I get so fascinated because I remember realizing that everything I'm seeing has color too. And so for me, color became a measurement for objectivity. And this idea may seem strange for some, but it has value to me at least. Um, yeah, so William, you say, could you explain more about the observer and space consciousness? Yeah, the observer is attributeless and it's not in time. It's a present. It's a presence. You can't have an explanation for it. It's not dualistic. So what I'm saying is, the observer is a non-dual, uh, uh, collective, unconditional being. Okay, behind this is what I'm saying. The observer, the seer of thought, is an experience that is the presence of energy just being. Uh, the object and subject of observance, which is required before you can even acknowledge the concept of space. That means you need matter before you can talk to space. I mean, the best I can do, William, is tell you that I just consider that this is a moment of being, like simplest definition, something nobody can really say anything. It's like, yeah, we're a moment of being. Okay, so now this moment of being, I say that there's an objective self and a subjective self. There's literally a component, very self evident, how objects are just being. And then there's a component where there is something that seems to be aware that it is aware of objectivity. And the ultimate awareness of that is so attributeless, where it enters. I have personally created a term, I call it the language threshold. And the language threshold is when an experience moves beyond the dualistic dimension where our language technology is currently designed in. And I'm saying that both the objective self and the subjective self are like two eyes that see the same, two sides of the same coin. That means you're experiencing the shadow and the light of existence at the same time. Chaos and order are no longer becoming just primal definers, they're becoming codependent definitions. That means when you see chaos, you'll see order soon. When you see order, you'll see chaos soon, and that's the game of history. And so it's not just that history has been changing, it's also how history has been acknowledged that's also been changing. And the sophistication of an advanced civilization is that really you realize uh, if every moment appears to happen once, then the ultimate value of the moment has to do with the effort of your own attention. So you have to become, as a person, especially now that it's after 2020, a pilot of your consciousness. That means the pilot is not defined by various elevations of the plane. The pilot is re-acknowledges the journey, the navigation. Many stories can be projected in thin air. Language is an evocational technology, you know? And we kind of reach a certain point where, William, I'll tell you, there was a person named Lao Tzu, and he wrote the Tao Te Ching, and he introduced the concept of the Tao and this kind of ultimate kind of unspeakable truth. He spoke about it in the way he said the Tao that can be spoken about is not the real Tao, and he said he who says do not know, he who doesn't say no, something like that. So the reason why it's there is because it is pointing to the evolution of the experience. Pretty much spiritual teachings to the to you can say the traditional bias of society were kind of like stories of butterflies being told to caterpillars who haven't experienced the cocoon. So it's like why would the caterpillar right now try to think it's a butterfly? Why would the person that's here right now in this objective realm think they're anything more than this objectivity? Right? But this doesn't mean there shouldn't be the presence of these stories because society is not purely a rational place. You know, if it was a rational place, there wouldn't be any problems because that rationality would eventually complete itself towards it's like it would perfect its illusion. But anyways, guys, I need a quick intermission. I'll be right back. Okay, guys, I'm back. To be honest, guys, I've kind of reached. I'll say one last thing. The whole idea for the title of this episode, as the moment turns, so do we. It means that we have to care about the conditional components of our intelligence, the things that we are in a sort of symbiosis with, and we have to maintain. This does not just require the laws of society, but they require it's like attention to also the laws of personal regulation. So what that means is you as a human being, how you govern your own intelligence is crucial. And most people seem to put intelligence in a box and not open it for a long time. They put it away. Let me tell you, intelligence has an unknown element. So what that means is the intellect doesn't want the answer. The intellect wants the endless pursuit. So, if we define civilization by a dynamic state, the purpose of life for the human being is an advanced civilization endlessly being built till the end of time. And I am for this. I want to see what this would look like. So I am constantly feeling that an advanced civilization is possible because ultimately, what are we? We're 8 billion creatures on a rock that still haven't found a way to communicate with each other in such an efficient way where an efficient civilization would be built. There was the story of the Tower of Babel, where I believe this is kind of comes to us from Christianity, this story. And the Tower of Babylon was this kind of story where all the people in the world gathered together and they were united under one language. And so they started building this tower that would be like this next level tallest tower that would reach the heavens. And this tower that reached the heavens like the clouds, then man level of the gods. And so the story goes as all humanity united under one language builds this tower. Eventually, at the top, when they're getting close, suddenly the gods see this, and one god comes to throw lightning, and then another god's like, "Yo, man, let me show you how it's done." And this god, this god comes, and what he does is he makes people speak different languages. And the moment people speak different languages, they cannot build this tower. They cannot cooperate to build this great civilization, this effort of civilization. So, what that means is that means there's a disadvantage to our separate languages. This is why I brought the whole idea of subnations. So what it means is that we can't ignore the tribes we're existing in. Nations are like tribes, you can think of it, big tribes. So these tribes will have to realize that the sharing of resources is crucial. I think it's this, excuse me, guys, but I'll say this, like Mr. Within, like, I think it's the stupidest idea to have nations. Now, sorry to say that. I mean, I don't mean to say that it's the stupidest idea, but I should say, I should have chosen my words more correctly. It's the most inefficient. It's not the best route because ultimately you see different parts of the surface of the earth have different resources. So if we were all united, all resources from all around the world could be administered and allocated properly. But because we've claimed land, we have separated the resources, and that's for me. That's just mind games. That means a lot of the world is occurring behind our eyes, and if we're not sensitive to this, the world behind our eyes could totally devour the world in front of our eyes. And if you're also not strong enough, sometimes the world in front of your eyes can devour the world behind your eyes. What I mean by that is you get so defined by an environment because you had no choice that you automatically believe the environment becomes your subconscious voice. Sometimes what a person deserves comes from what they have endured through. And if they feel that certain things must be accumulated only through a certain endurance and confrontation of the actual act, then it's as if they won't allow the mind to open its wings. So, anyways, guys, I gotta say one thing at least about the subtitle. Worlds that tap on your shoulder. Yeah, sometimes a thought can enter one's moment and uh, literally open up new depth. I remember there came a time in my life that when I actually began wondering what the mind is, I began feeling like like my mind was this Rubik's cube, okay, that I had to solve. And so I was trying out many algorithms, many things, and I eventually realized the algorithm is a natural one. So when you want to, for example, solve a Rubik's Cube outside, you can do as much as you can of it, but eventually there will require a certain algorithm, you know? There was this professor who managed to figure it out in 30 minutes. And you can kind of say a lot of people's belief systems are algorithms to their existential condition. They're literally implementing a strategy. A linguistic strategy, a person who believes in certain things. Now, it's not about declaring war or suggesting how beliefs have caused war, not only worship, but warships. It's just to realize that the system is not perfect. If we choose to judge it by perfection, everybody is guilty. But if we look at it and we say it's imperfect and how do we reduce the percentage of the imperfection, then we would constantly be engaged with readapting the model to new experiences. So it's as if rather than you being defined by what you did years ago, you're becoming defined by who you are now consciously. You are a creature of your attention, and to become acquainted with this attention, to realize your intelligence in the moment, it's like what greater thing can life give you? It has given you a mind that is endless like the sky. That is the gift of the cosmos. It has allowed man to be so small that he can get fascinated by the big. If we were giants right now, we would not care for what was under our feet. So technologies are not just external, they can be internal. Language is what is it? Sentence structure is the person. Is that possible? Can words be actual worlds? Somebody once said, I think it was kind of like a psychological study where they're like, you can't dream of a face you've never seen. And if you dream of a face you've never seen, the argument can be made that you subconsciously saw that face. Now, I've dreamed of an inhuman face. So I can totally know that my subconscious doesn't, the dream life is very fascinating too, to be honest. But it depends on where you want to build. The more preferenceless you become, the more freedom there is in altered states of consciousness for movement to occur. That means you're more like entering the world, you're navigating in the world, but sometimes you navigate as the world. So this is a very important distinction, you know? Yeah, yeah. So Windsor, I'm not saying that um, the economical system, what can we say? The economical system and the educational system will integrate. That means in the future there's not going to be a difference between schools and corporations. That means it's we're going to have this idea that the education, I think this is what's going to happen there. The mainstream is going to feel that education must always be continued. So the corporate structure begins to kind of fighting with all the students that are going. So imagine like companies become schools where the people who pay to go into that school end up becoming going and working in that company. I don't know. I hope that the whole educational system changes, but either way, there will be, I call it an apocalypse for knowledge due to an experiential realization. That apocalypse for knowledge would be the same thing I said earlier, that we sparked language. That means language is being puppeteered by our own strings. We connect the strings of a subject and a symbol to an object. And so we puppeteer through this. This is why to truly be comfortable with a changing system, I think the comfort cannot be established by identification with a static image. This is why I don't know how people are judging themselves. How can you? How can one moment of view define all the moments of view you've navigated through? There's something about effort towards an authentic view that stabilizes um, the expansion of the intensity of energetic experience. So it's kind of like if I tell you you have the freedom to measure this world in whatever way you want, now if I ask you where are all these measurements? Where are all these calculations of the world? And you'd notice they are hovering in empty space if the whole planet is. We have a binary psychology as a species through language. The shadow and the light, the known and the unknown, the visible and the invisible, the past and the future. Various ways the axis of ideological existence can be held in the moment. I chose this picture, guys, because like how unique is this? I mean, I'm telling you, um, this seems like all these fish are simultaneously being one collective being. So it seems like as if all these fish have the same soul. And that these like scuba divers are like, what the? And so it's interesting. It's kind of like there is an electromagnetic language that nature speaks collectively. And it's fascinating just how far human beings have dared to go move in their world. That means there is, I feel like uh, there's definitely as this scholar would say, there's two worlds that the person lives in. There's one world. The first world is the world where it began from the moment you were born, and it endured, and it ended the moment you died. So the dash between the years on the grave are kind of like that first life, the life of your conscious birth and your conscious transition. And so the other life is the other world is that the world that was here before you and the world that will be here still after you. And when my individual kind of self inquiry got satisfied, experientially, I began to see that it is that other world, that world that was here before us and will be here after us, that is more fascinating than just the individual kind of fangs of the desire born self gratification of the individual hedonistic view. So that means it's like you live for yourself until you realize the greatest thing yourself can do is its collective being, is its collective expression, is that we do not forget about humanity so easily. We do not forget that our ancestors, their imagination had the potential of myth. Many great mythologies that influenced many cultures were written by poets. And these poets realized the value of a new imagery in the mind of man. And so I feel the archaic revival, as Terence McKenna spoke, it has now gone into a stage, a sort of phase where it's no longer just past patterns, but past emotions to how thought stood will arise again. What that means is, as the civilization becomes globalized, one common pattern finds itself in many new environments and experiences a sort of solar trail, a trail of its soul through various manifest moments. And as all these manifest moments are seen to be the same journey in the eyes of the being, it means kind of behind your eyes, you are the world. In front of your eyes, you're what's in it. I believe I referred to this earlier. So, anyways, guys, nature is fascinating. Look at what fish are doing. This is what a school of fish are doing. Now imagine if a school of humans did this. Imagine that there was something that we found, that common language that helped build the Tower of Babylon. That common language was the language of experiential advancement. It's like attempt greatness when it has come to see you. When you experience a moment where it's sometimes there's a joy of kind of fitting in a crowd, and then there's a joy of stepping away from a crowd and realizing who you are, unconditionally in your own experience, rather than condition your value being conditional to the eyes out, to other minds that don't per se have your eyes. This is why on some level, for a person to get angry at words and language is, I mean, when we realize we don't have each other's eyes, the judgments become less heavy. It's not just that the world is watching the mind is watching itself. And really, it is a sort of return to direct experience from indirect, subjective landscapes. That direct experience is intelligent on its own. It's as if, like, the leaf that fell in the river couldn't say much. It couldn't tell the river where it was going, where to go. So you see, it's like reality can is advanced as that, I find. So, anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in, and I hope this episode was helpful. Much blessings and namaste.